it's in the best interest of us, regardless of partisanship or anything else, to make sure that we all stand in agreement if we decide to show military influence.
I agree with the sentiment. I'm not sure if we got to the specifics of would you vote for a resolution to send our soldiers, a UN resolution, to a war that hadn't been authorized by the U.S.
And I think that probably the best answer I can give you is that as a member of the National Security Council, I would encourage them to make sure that they had these conversations with Congress and that they have Congress's buy-in before we interfere.
I would go one step farther in the sense that many say, well, we should have the advice of Congress and we ought to occasionally go down there and pat them on the back and talk to them. No, the rules are pretty specific. We don't go to war really unless Congress votes on war. And the reason I bring this up is we may well be in a situation, we're in a war right now primarily with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. That war has not been authorized. We've had no vote here on whether or not we should be involved in that war. Some try to stretch a resolution that said we could go after those who attacked us on 9/11. ISIS did not attack us on 9/11. They're not related in any way to anybody who attacked us on 9/11. Right. So we have had no vote, and one generation shouldn't bind another generation to war. But that well could come before you. Right now we're at war. You could say, well, we're already at war. We can send people there in the UN banner. Well, you shouldn't. I mean, we should say to you should not vote for that. You should come back to us and say, I'll vote for it gladly after Congress does their job and authorizes. But no U.S. soldier should ever fight under any international banner without a vote here by Congress. And I can't state that strong enough because that is a check. That is a check and a balance to try to prevent unnecessary war. There's
Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution grants the authority to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies to the U.S. Congress. Apparently, any appropriation of money to that use should be for no longer than a term of 2 years as well, which I don't think is being followed.
Yield at this time 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate very much his work in this effort. This is a very important part of this legislation. This is not best T, but it's best part. By far, 3002 of this bill is the best part of this entire bill. The only thing I would like to add is that the money being spent in Bosnia and Iraq, $1.8 billion, shouldn't be spent there either, because I'm frightened that we will put our men in harm's way, and then a situation will occur, and it will be virtually impossible for the Congress to turn down acceleration and amplification of the conflict over there. It was stated that only 5 times we have declared war in our history. True. But who's going to stand here and say that men that died in Vietnam and in Korea weren't in a war? They were illegal. They were unconstitutional. This is a very sound effort to bring back, once again, the constitutional responsibility of all of us to declare war, and only Congress can do that.
There's very much a focus on limiting what they saw as dangerous power. And they were focused on the power of the king, because Great Britain, even though it had a parliament, the king still had extraordinary power. Many of the founders pointed out the fact that he could both decide to go to war and direct those wars. So the founders of the Constitutional Convention were very explicit. They wanted to split that apart. You find in the debates, again and again, references to the problems of the king. Even Alexander Hamilton, somebody who came very strongly for executive power, is one who afterwards said, look, the king had the power to declare war as well as manage the war. President has a much more limited power. The president only, as commander-in-chief, only directs military operations.
The American system, as outlined in the U.S. Constitution, is unique because it was designed not to empower, but to restrain government. To understand why, you have to place yourself in the context which the American founders found themselves. This was during the heyday of liberalism, when ideas such as all men are created equal and individuals have rights, natural rights, which are discernible through your reason alone, which are granted not by the state, but you have naturally. The end of the 18th century was a time of profound change, when before this period you had had the absolute rule of the king. Now the people were sovereign. It was a time of breaking down of trade barriers, of quotas, of grants of monopoly privilege. The Bank of England was stripped of its monopoly on banknotes. Because liberalism was a rejection of absolutism, the founders were very careful to limit the power of the presidency. They didn't want an imperial presidency like we see today, so they gave to Congress the power to go to war. Jefferson argued the executive branch is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. In the context of modern political economy, presidents get great support from the public in terms of poll numbers when they go to war. One can argue that that was why George W. Bush was reelected.
Despite never officially declaring war, the United States' involvement in Vietnam spanned decades, beginning with financial and military aid to the South Vietnamese government during the First Indochina War and escalating into direct military intervention in the Vietnam War. Following World War II, Vietnam declared its independence from French colonial rule, leading to the First Indochina War. The United States, concerned about the spread of communism in Asia, provided financial and military aid to the French forces. After the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam. The United States continued to support South Vietnam under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, who faced growing opposition from the Communist Viet Cong guerrillas. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy authorized the deployment of U.S. military advisors to South Vietnam. By 1965, with the war intensifying, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered direct U.S. military intervention, and the Vietnam War began. The Vietnam War was a long and costly conflict for the United States. At the peak of its involvement, there were over 500,000 U.S. troops stationed in Vietnam. The U.S. military employed a variety of tactics, including ground and air combat, bombing campaigns, and defoliation efforts. However, the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies proved resilient, and the war dragged on for years.
Adams was right. The wars did not make America great. The wars. 3,000 people were killed on September 11th, 2001. As Paul Wolfowitz admitted, the main reason Osama bin Laden cited for attacking America was the U.S. military bases left in Saudi Arabia for the so-called dual containment policy against Iraq and Iran in the 1990s after Iraq War I, the Persian Gulf War. Bin Laden's plan was to provoke the United States into invading Afghanistan so he could replicate the Mujahideen's earlier success against the USSR with U.S. support in the 1980s. This time against us, to bog us down, bleed us to bankruptcy, and create a choking life for the American people under the tyranny of our security state. And after the last 20 years of war in Afghanistan and across the Middle East, we have less influence there than ever before. A $30 trillion national debt, an increasingly invasive surveillance state and militarized police state, almost 7,000 dead troops, 37,000 if you count those who killed themselves in the aftermath, and the worst partisan, political, racial, and other social division of my lifetime anyway. I'm 45. So much of this crisis is directly due to the costs, financial and otherwise, of America's Middle East regime change wars. Let's review some recent regime changes and their consequences. Note, that in neoconservative doctrine, democracy absolutely must be spread to Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, but not Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Oman, Egypt, or Pakistan. And if there's a democratically elected government that our government doesn't like, the U.S. won't hesitate to try to overthrow it, like in Algeria in 1993, Gaza in 2007, Egypt in 2013, and Ukraine in 2004 and 2014. Now, to the regime changes, I'm sorry I have to skip Kosovo and Somalia for time. First on our list is President Carter and Reagan's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s to overthrow the communist regime there. This led directly to the rise of Haqqani, Hekmatyar, the Taliban, and al-Qaeda. Carter and Reagan's support for Saddam Hussein's Iraq in its 1980s war to overthrow the Ayatollah in Iran also backfired. It solidified the mullah's power in Persia and led directly to the so-called Gulf War, after Iraq invaded Kuwait in a dispute over debts from the war against Iran. As mentioned, America's first Iraq War, launched to restore the Kuwaiti monarchy in 1991, led directly to the dual containment policy against Iraq and Iran from military bases in Saudi Arabia and al-Qaeda's war against the United States. Since 2001, after failing to deploy enough reinforcements to capture or kill bin Laden at Tora Bora or allow the Delta Force to pursue him into Pakistan, the Bush administration instead sought regime change against the Taliban in Kabul, who Bill Clinton had supported just a few years before in their own regime change against the Mujahideen warlords whom Presidents Carter and Reagan had supported against the communists in the 1980s. This led to 20 years of war, including a massive so-called surge escalation halfway through for absolutely nothing, and leading to the Taliban walking right back into power as the U.S. withdrew in the summer of 2021. Saddam Hussein in Iraq War II. When David Wormser wrote his clean break plan for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's first government in 1996, he acknowledged that targeting secularist dictators, Hussein and Assad, for regime change in Iraq and Syria could further fan the flames of Islamist anti-American terrorism. But he said the solution to that problem would just have to wait until the war against them was over. Maybe in 1996, this was somehow understandable, from a hawk's perspective at least. According to Richard Schultz in the Weekly Standard, in the 1990s, the Pentagon Joint Staff would repeat as cliche that, quote, terrorism is a small price to pay for being a superpower.